Hello guys, welcome back. My name's Nathan and today I'm going to be answering the question, which NHL franchise was the most successful in the 2010s? Now to answer that fateful question, I have 10 different NHL teams who I think have been the most successful in this 2010s decade. Of course, we'll be going through 10 all the way down to number 1, and in my opinion, the most successful franchise of the decade, of the past 10 years. So, which teams are in my top 10, and which team do I see as the most successful of the decade? Watch till the end, and of course, subscribe if you're new. Alright, as usual, we're gonna waste zero time getting into my top 10, and for my 10th team, my 10th most successful team in the NHL this decade, I'm gonna go with the Nashville Predators. Now, the Nashville Predators had a very interesting decade, to say the least. They started out the decade in 2011 with the whole jersey redesign, going from the blue and white jerseys to the yellow and the Nashville look that we know and love today, or hate today, depending on your definition. But for Nashville, they went to the Cup final in 2017, and overall had been one of the best teams of the decade. They made it multiple times to the playoffs, and had been a routine playoff team. This year isn't going too hot for them, but as a whole, they've been super successful, and while they haven't been able to get that Stanley Cup, again, they were pretty close in 2017 if the Pittsburgh Penguins didn't exist. And saying that Nashville made the playoffs quite a few times is definitely putting it lightly. They made it 8 different times throughout the 2010s, and consistently were a pretty great playoff team. And again, not able to get that Stanley Cup, but even without that Stanley Cup, they were a success on off the ice. Now they're one of the bigger hockey markets, being in a non-typical hockey market, and have one of the better fan bases in the NHL. For a team that didn't really have that before the decade, they've grown quite a bit on the ice and off of it too. Alright, now getting into my number 9 pick, my 9th most successful NHL franchise this decade. Now I'm going to go into my second favorite team that disappoints me all the time, that being the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, the Lightning, of course, won the final appearance against the Chicago Blackhawks in 2015. They made the playoffs 6 times out of the decade, and was somewhat successful. I would say was pretty successful. But of course, not able to get that Stanley Cup, even in the Cup finals, and were there and close so many different times. Of course, of all the choke jobs, they would probably be number 1 in the choke rankings of 2010, but as a whole, we're still pretty successful, and the attendance that they have still, to this day, is one of the best in the NHL, which should not be understated. And if they actually got it done, they would be a lot higher in this list, but of course, all the choke jobs over the past decade have weighed them down quite a bit. But I still think they're one of the most successful teams consistently throughout the regular season, and even when they were injured and bad, they were still somehow able to compete in the Atlantic Division for almost the whole decade, and were almost always good despite a couple of years early in the decade. And yes, the choke jobs will be the defining thing for the decade for them. I still can't ignore how good the attendance has been, how good the team has been, and just consistently good. Which for Tampa in the late 2000s is definitely an improvement. Now moving on to the 8th most successful team of the decade, and I'm going to give it to the New York Rangers. Now, you can make an argument that the Rangers could be a lot higher in this list, and it might make a lot of sense. Now, when it came to the stats, the Rangers, of course, went to the Cup final in 2014. Alec Martinez, we don't need to go down that whole road again. And also made the playoffs 7 times compared to Tampa 6 times of the decade. And when it comes to New York, in a situation like that, they were so good for like the first half, and of course it started to slide a little bit, but their rebuild was so successful that I almost count it as part of the success of the decade. But the problem, of course, just like the Tampa Bay Lightning, is that they were not able to get it done. I would say the Lightning had the edge a little bit in going farther in the playoffs consistently, but for the New York Rangers, they made the playoffs more, and also having that super successful rebuild that's been brilliant for them and will be brilliant for them is a huge added bonus. And for New York, honestly, just unfortunately, Henrik Lundqvist did not get a cup this decade. Hopefully that changes sometime soon. But for New York, they put themselves in position to succeed throughout the decade. When they needed to rebuild, they rebuilt, and now they have a beautiful future ahead of them to continue the winning ways into the 2020s, which in my opinion is the definition of success. Now, just like the Tampa Bay Lightning and just like the New York Rangers, we're going to go to my number 7th most successful NHL team, that being the San Jose Sharks. Now, this decade was depressing, amazing, and everything mixed into one for San Jose. With so much succeedness. I don't even know what words I'm saying anymore. Succeedness with so much failure. It was really everything in one this decade. But for San Jose, they made the Cup final once, obviously losing to the San Jose Sharks. They made the playoffs a whopping 9 times throughout the decade, which last time I checked is pretty good. And just like Tampa, I think the failure will be kind of what defines them this decade, which is a much bigger shame because San Jose again making the playoffs 9 times. San Jose has a good team on their hands, and it's been that way throughout the whole decade. They've been consistently good, but unfortunately haven't gotten Lord Stanley. And finally, we can now get into number 6 and finally onto the teams who have won at least one Stanley Cup. And going to the team who was very close to being basically the San Jose Sharks, that being the Washington Capitals. And I'm so freaking thankful that they did get that one Stanley Cup because it just makes the whole decade better. I mean, we can all agree, Ovi getting the Cup is freaking amazing. Of course, the one Stanley Cup and the one appearance, the Washington Capitals were able to make the playoffs 9 different times throughout the decade. They have the second most wins of the decade of any NHL team, and it makes a lot of sense. Of course, throughout most of the decade, they haven't been able to get out of the second round, which would have been failure for them if they hadn't won that Stanley Cup. But versus the Vegas Golden Knights, they were able to get it done, raise it up, and get the Cup for Washington. And that just redeems the whole decade, in my opinion, because throughout most of it, they weren't able to get out of the second round, yes, but Ovi with that Cup just makes it all just better. Everything. It makes it all worth it. Now, just like the Washington Capitals, another team that is basically in their same situation, now going on to number 5, the 5th most successful NHL team, that being the St. Louis Blues. Now, they were very close, like Washington, to not doing anything, and I don't think anybody really expected them to do anything because they were the St. Louis Blues. They were the running joke, oh, no Stanley Cups, take that, haha, funny, St. Louis. And then they decided to beat the Dallas Stars, my favorite team, and then decided to crush San Jose, and then did that to the Boston Bruins. So, the joke's on us. But what if I told you that the St. Louis Blues were actually good this whole time? I know, it's crazy. They were 3rd in wins in the decade of NHL teams behind the Capitals and the Penguins. They had 7 different playoff appearances, and of course, topped off the decade with the Stanley Cup. And you know, as a Dallas Stars fan, of course I'm still salty, but it's a great story. Getting that first Stanley Cup is huge for them, and of course, they got the last laugh versus basically everybody in the NHL, which I respect quite a bit. Alright, now getting into the elite of the elite, and these are the teams that were the most successful, obviously. Going into my number 4 pick, though, I'm going to give the nod to the Boston Bruins. Just over the St. Louis Blues, I know, but I think rightfully deserved. Now, for Boston, they went to this Cup final 3 different times throughout the decade, only got 1 Stanley Cup. Thank you, Chicago and St. Louis, for that, by the way. I appreciate it. But yes, they were still, without that, super successful. Obviously, the Stanley Cup versus the Vancouver Canucks, that Game 7 win. Zdeno Chara with the Stanley Cup. Either way, though, Boston was consistently solid. During the whole decade, they were able to make the playoffs 8 different times, and were still able to restock everything. Now, with David Pastrnak, Jake DeBrusk, and all the guys they've added along the way, they've made sure this winning is sustained, especially heading into the 2020s, and they got a great team still as well. It was great to start out the decade, and the team is still one of the best, if not the best in the NHL, heading into 2020. And now moving on to my number 3 most successful team of the 2010s decade, now going to go on to the LA Kings. Now the LA Kings, of course, the 2 Stanley Cups, 2012 and 2014. 2 cups in any decade makes it a pretty successful one, and it's been that way for LA. Now, if you put up just the second half of this decade, then no, they wouldn't crack any top 10. But of course, with that first half, the 2012 Cup, 2014 Cup, Jonathan Quick, doing his thing, it makes them this high. And when you get 2 cups in any decade, again, as I said, you were a successful team. And of course, they got the tied for the second most cups of the decade too. And they were a consistent playoff team throughout most of that early 2010s too. And for a decent chunk of the second half as well. They just haven't been that great of a team recently, which just comes with the multiple winning seasons, the multiple cups as well. It's just a factor of the age. A lot of that core has gone by the wayside, but in their prime, when all the players were there, they were a very good team, and they do have the cups to back that up. And now getting into the final 2, between the Pittsburgh Penguins and the Chicago Blackhawks. And between these 2 teams, I was debating a ton, and you could go either or, in my opinion. But on the bottom line, the Pittsburgh Penguins have 2 cups, and the Chicago Blackhawks have 1 more. And for my number 2, my second most successful team of the 2010s, I'm going to give it to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, of course, the 2 Stanley Cups, 2016 and 2017, obviously were the highlight. But for the Pittsburgh Penguins, they had a pretty good decade. They made the playoffs in all 10 years, did not miss the playoffs once throughout the whole decade, which is insanely insane if you think about it. And for the Penguins, there was a lot of first round exits, second round exits there that weren't all too successful. There was some decent choke jobs in the early first half, and while that second half was a lot better, it doesn't redeem it completely. But for Pittsburgh, they were a consistently good team that made the playoffs and were always competitive, and they do have the 2 cups with it, they do have the playoff success with it, and of course, they also have Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin, which is a nice bonus. But for Pittsburgh, I think you can 100% make the case for them being number 1. Again, making the playoffs in all 10 years, having the 2 Stanley Cups, and having all the success that comes with it. I'm not denying the success because I think they probably should be number 1 if another team didn't exist, but for the Penguins, either way, they have the 2 Stanley Cups, which is really all that matters right now. And now, going into my number 1, my most successful team of the 2010s decade. And not Pittsburgh, not LA, not Boston, but yes, my least favorite team in the NHL, my number 1 being the Chicago Blackhawks. And yes, I do have to admit that they had a pretty good decade for themselves. And no, I don't like saying that, but I kind of have to at this point. And of course, going along with the 3 cups Chicago got, they ended up making the playoffs 8 times throughout the decade, only missing the playoffs these past couple of years. And when it comes to Chicago, obviously the 3 cups are there, but they were one of the most successful teams of the decade regardless. When it came to the superstars they had, how many times they went far in the playoffs, it was just unbelievable. And as a Dallas Stars fan, I can attest. They're my least favorite team. I won't like Chicago ever, but I will admit, they have been a pretty good team this decade, and in my opinion, the most successful team. Even at this point, they missed the playoffs for the past couple of years. They're still number 1 in attendance, blowing every team out of the water, and that's also a big success too. The team isn't all that great, and I'm not even sure what direction they're trying to be right now, but regardless, the 3 Stanley Cups, 2010, 2013, and 2015, are the track record that Chicago has, and it's a pretty good one too. Anyways, before I ramble on about the Chicago Blackhawks getting a jillion Stanley Cups and robbing it from everybody, I need to hear y'all's thoughts down in those comments down below. Let me know what you think about my 10 picks, my most successful teams of the decade, what you agree and disagree with, and of course the question on to you. Who do you think was the most successful franchise of the NHL in the 2010s? But if you guys do in fact want to watch another Grav video, which I must say is a pretty fantastic idea, I would watch this video where I make my all-decade 2010s NHL team build. Forwards, defensemen, goaltending, you name it, I have it right there. But that'll be it for today, guys. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and of course, hit that notification bell. Of course, comment down below your thoughts on the team and the teams that I picked. Let me know what you agree and disagree with. Share this video with your friends. Get the video out there, boys. Almost at 9K subscribers. I'm Nathan, aka Grav, and I'll see y'all in the next video or stream. Goodbye. I don't know what that was, but we'll just go with it, okay?